This is our presentation, It's Human Rights in China. It's by Rachel, Sydney, Hope, Julie, Kimmy, and Heather.
We're going to start out with the origin of human rights in China, and a basic definition of human rights are the beliefs that a person is entitled to, such as right to equality, freedom of discrimination, right to a fair trial, and etc. The World Wars spurred global acceptance of the need for human rights, but communist countries such as China took a little while longer to catch on. The United Nations was established in 1945, and in 1948 the UN General Assembly published a document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This document was the first of its kind to call for the international protection of fundamental human rights, such as life, liberty, and security, as well as judicial, social, civil, economic, and political rights. The People's Republic of China was established in 1949. Prior to the rule of Mao Zedong, China was ruled as a dynasty under feudalism, and after the establishment of the communist government, Mao enacted several political, social, and economic reforms. The biggest thing that he did was consolidate the power of the government. The Common Program of China guaranteed women's rights and encouraged education, described plans for rural reform and industry development, but in reality, the Common Program of China said that all would be free of inequality, poverty, and foreign domination, as well as have rights of freedom of thought, speech, publication, and religious belief. But it did not include political reactionaries or people who opposed the government, and it was up to the government to determine what exactly that meant. The 5-year plan was 1953 through 1957. It was designed to increase manufacturing output and establish a foundation of heavy industry. There were 4 campaigns during this time. The Resist America and Aid Korea campaign was directed towards foreigners and people connected with foreigners. The Suppression of Counter-Revolutionaries campaign described people's right to life and freedom of thought, but through this campaign they were absolutely demolished. The 3 anti-campaign was filled with corruption, and the 5 anti-campaign was an all-out assault on the government of China and focused more on forcing the people to conform to the CCP's ideologies through primarily psychological manipulation, such as confessing crimes that they didn't commit. These different campaigns violated people's life and freedom of thought. The 100 Flowers campaign was in 1956 through 1957. It was a period during the 5-year plan in which citizens, intellectuals, and non-party members were encouraged by the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party to critique the government. The initial goal of the 100 Flower campaign was to be a time for party members and non-members to discuss the problems in China. Intellectuals were known as rightists, and the 100 Flowers campaign became known as anti-rightists. 300,000 citizens were branded with this label, and it ruined their career for the rest of their lives. Here's a short video about the Great Leap Forward that explains it pretty much in its entirety.
The deadliest leader of all time. Mao Zedong. He inspired near godlike worship among hundreds of millions of Chinese. As the hero of the peasant-backed revolution in 1949, Mao took over China, promising to bring power to the people through communism. He presented himself as the perfect leader, but there was a dark side. The early years of his communist regime would see some 3 million political dissenters put to death. But the toll from his strong-arm tactics pales in comparison to the Armageddon he unintentionally caused, a government policy gone disastrously wrong. These pictures represent but a tiny fraction of the millions who died during the Chinese famine of 1958 to 1961, the worst the world has ever known. Estimates of the dead range between 30 and 40 million people, as if the entire state of California had been wiped out. The famine and its deaths were the direct result of Mao's so-called Great Leap Forward, Mao's relentless push to increase steel production and simultaneously organize farming into mass communes. The Great Leap Forward, however, was an economic disaster and a human tragedy.
The idea of organizing mass collectives to replace family farms turned out to be woefully inefficient, a vast misuse of resources.
Because of Mao's headstrong determination, the Great Leap Forward was not abandoned for 3 years, during which time an extraordinary number of Chinese, tens of millions, starved to death. Yet with Mao's Cultural Revolution, the millions who survived his lethal decisions again came to revere him, despite his being the deadliest leader of all time. Under Mao, 45 million people were executed or died of neglect. That's more than twice the number of deaths ordered by Hitler and Stalin combined. Stay tuned. There's much more ahead on The Roost.
The Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976. The Cultural Revolution was Mao Zedong's second attempt to come back into power after the failing Great Leap Forward and surrendering his presidency over to Li Shaqi. During this decade of chaos, millions of ordinary Chinese experienced restricted freedom, intimidation, social upheaval, and economic disruption. This time period was a decade when rights of the people were totally abandoned. The Red Years from 1966 to 68. On June 1, 1966, the editorial Sweep Away All Monsters and Demons was published. On the same day, a poster had appeared a week earlier at Peking University. It accused the university leaders of being Khrushchev-type revisionists. The students started scrutinizing the backgrounds of their teachers, accusing some of being bourgeois elements or even counter-revolutionaries. Some went too far, taking to task leading party members. They were punished for their activities by work teams sent by the current leaders. The Red Years continued. Instead of supporting his two colleagues, Mao accused them of suppressing the students and running a dictatorship. August of 1966 was when Mao mobilized thousands of students in Beijing to restore socialism by cleansing society of any reactionary elements. This was the beginning of Mao's revolution. Red Guards carrying Mao's Little Red Book began popping up everywhere. They vowed to defend Mao and carry out the Cultural Revolution. They went on the rampage, using violence to force the Chinese people to obey Mao's will by burning books, overturning tombstones in cemeteries, tearing down temples, vandalizing churches, and attacking all signs of the past, including street names and shop signs. Mass chaos in China. By late September, more than 1,700 people had been killed in Beijing alone during this rampage period. Millions of others were tortured, humiliated, imprisoned, and stolen from. Then, by January 1967, the chaos was too much that the army intervened, asked to push through the revolution and bring the situation order under control by supporting the true proletarian left. As different military leaders supported different factions, all of them equally certain that they represented the true voice of Mao Zedong, the country slid into civil war. Soon, people were fighting each other with machine guns and anti-aircraft artillery in the streets. The Black Years, 1968 to 71. The first phase of the Cultural Revolution came to an end in the summer of 1968, as new so-called Revolutionary Party committees took over the party and the state. Military officers were who would carry out orders from Mao. Without hesitation or questions were put into power. Over the next 3 years, they turned the country into a garrison state with soldiers overseeing schools, factories, and government units. With this, a nationwide witch hunt began for traitors, renegades, and spies. The Black Years continued. In Shanghai alone, 170,000 people were harassed. More than 5,400 committed suicide, were beaten to death, or executed. In Guangdong province as a whole, the estimated body count was at 40,000. In Inner Mongolia, close to 800,000 people were incarcerated, interrogated, and denounced in mass meetings. Torture chambers appeared across the province. Tongues were ripped out, teeth extracted with pliers, eyes gouged from their sockets, flesh branded with hot irons. The Gray Years, 1971 to 76. By this time, the revolutionary chaos had exhausted almost everyone in China. Even at the height of the Cultural Revolution, many people who were suspicious of the one-party state had offered no more than appearance of compliance, having their true feelings and thoughts suppressed. In a silent revolution, millions upon millions of villagers surreptitiously reconnected with traditional practices as they opened black markets, shared out collective assets, divided the land, and opened underground factories. This is one of the worst decades in the history of China when it comes to freedom and rights of the people. If somebody was not aligned with Mao's communist way of thinking and living, he or she was prosecuted. Chinese people suffered through suppression of religious freedom, restriction of cultural freedom, and extremely low living standards.
The Gang of Four was from 1976 to now. The Gang of Four were very influential Chinese political party communists. After Mao's death in 1976, the Gang of Four were arrested by Hao Guofeng, who was named party chairman and premier. The members of the Gang of Four consisted of Mao's wife and 3 of her associates who rose to power during the Cultural Revolution and advocated Mao's ideas and policies. In 1981, they were arrested and were charged with treason and other crimes against the Chinese state. They were also tried for the deaths of over 34,000 people over the course of the Cultural Revolution and for the persecution of over 750,000 Chinese people. This was post-Mao era. All 4 were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The different types of rights in China. The Chinese Communist Party has continued to dominate Chinese life, and the people have been systematically denied freedoms for all kids. Family and women's domestic rights. Strict censorship in the media and on the internet. They were denied freedom of religion, expression, and association. People with disabilities have limited rights and often have their rights taken away. And then there were land rights. I'm going to now go on each topic and tell you more information. The family and women's domestic rights. Family and women's rights have been restricted because of tradition. Families were allowed 1 child, and if they had more than 1, they were required to pay a fee. Only wealthy families could afford the fee, while the poor families were forced to have abortions. In October of 2015, it was announced that couples were now allowed to have 2 children. While some would argue that the two-child revision can be considered a human rights victory, the government still maintains control of family size and support the women's domestic rights. And the support for women's domestic rights are still lacking. Strict censorship in the media and internet. There are restrictions for all people, but especially they restrict what the children can and can't learn. The education minister banned educational tools that promote Western values and censored speech that slandered and attacked the party. This type of stringent censorship may illustrate how the government feels it must maintain a tight grip of the people's minds and thoughts in order to guarantee the people's loyalty, and they will resort to violations of basic human rights to achieve this goal. Freedom, religion, expression, and association. Religion is an important area that is restricted by the Chinese government. In 2015, authorities demanded the removal of crosses and even tore down churches for not complying or for simple representing a religion that was not included in the 5 officially approved religions. Anything practiced outside of those 5 religions will be considered cult, and a sentence to life in prison will be given if caught. People with disabilities. Many people that have disabilities are treated very poorly and as if they do not matter. Universities are allowed to deny anyone if they have any kind of disability, even if they take an acceptance exam and pass. Land rights. Land rights are a very large issue in China. The government owns all of the land, so the villagers are just renters for a certain amount of time. And that concludes our presentation, and this is
Our thesis statement.
Yes, this is our thesis statement. The fight for human rights is an ongoing fight for the citizens of Communist China. They will continue to struggle until they receive their natural-born rights. Will that day ever come? And here's our works cited page. The end.